You're listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House.
Hello everybody, I'm Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House, and Hello everybody, I'm Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House, and we're very pleased to present you this week's Arts in Isolation podcast, part of Converging Paths, an initiative that many of you are already familiar with, as you have been following us week after week. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our partner, the Baraka Trust, and our sponsors, the Al-Tajir Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, as they help us to make this podcast possible. So today, I'm very happy to have here with me Scott Redford, who is the Nasser David Khalili Professor of Islamic Art and Archaeology at SOAS London. He's a specialist in the art, archaeology and architecture of Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean in the medieval period, and has participated in extensive archaeological excavations and surveys in Turkey, Egypt, Cyprus, amongst many other places. And the reason I'm so happy is because I was very privileged to be Professor Redford's student in 2016, where I had the pleasure to learn from the geniality of his teaching and stimulating classes. So I welcome both Scott and Saif al-Rashidi, Director of the Baraka Trust, who will be discussing today the Western Mediterranean Crusades and the challenges and stereotypes that we as a modern society have built around them.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for being willing to join the podcast series. And it's really a privilege to host you talking about the art of the Crusades, one of the subjects on which you know a great deal, and you've captivated so many people in class and in other places. So we're very happy that our listeners around the world can benefit from your great knowledge and humor.
My pleasure.
Well, most people think of the Crusades simply as a series of bloody battles between Northern Europe and the Middle East. As an archaeologist, as an art historian, you look at the art, the architecture, and the archaeology of this period. What do they tell us?
Thanks, Saif. First of all, I wanted to define what the Crusades are. The term crusade is actually a French invention from the 19th century. At the time, nobody called them crusades, and I am going to be talking about the Crusades in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the area today of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, into Egypt in the south and into Turkey in the north, also Cyprus. But there are later crusades, of course, in the Aegean, and there are contemporary crusades in the Baltic and in the Iberian Peninsula. So when we talk about the crusades in this talk, we're talking about 200 years, the 12th and 13th centuries, of conflict and alliance between Muslims and Christians in the Eastern Mediterranean. So that's a little definition at the beginning. And your question sets up a series of dualities. And that's one of the problems when you study the Crusades. It's Muslim versus Christian. And if you are going to argue against what you call bloody battles, 200 years of bloody battles, which is the traditional way to look at the Crusades, then you definitely want to avoid the other duality, which is what the Spanish scholar Maria Luisa Menocal for medieval Spain called convivencia, living together. You know, neither is true. It wasn't 200 years of bloody battles, and it wasn't 200 years of living together and getting along and exchanging ideas and goods and toleration. But both of these things obviously present. So the other duality is between textual sources and what archaeology and art history can tell us. And that's one of the great things about art history and material culture in general, is that you can understand a lot more about the interactions of peoples and cultures by looking at objects, by looking at buildings, by looking at cities. When the texts are telling you one thing, the monuments and the architecture oftentimes tells you other things. So what are these things? One of the things is that just as in today's world, people use religion for political ends. At the time, people are using religion for their personal as well as political ends. But also you can see in history, but also in the material culture, the results of alliances and cooperation And all of these are, of course, not necessarily a result of just wanting to get along, but also as a result of personal gain and realpolitik, shall we call it.
So what does the art and the architecture and archaeology tell us about the period? Can you give us some examples?
So the art and archaeology tells us that there is an awful lot more exchange of material goods, exchange of architectural ideas than the sources will tell us. The sources are generally written by historians who work for the court or by historians who work for structures of religious power. And so they are very intent on giving you a high cultural view of things and an idealistic view of things. And the art shows that there's an awful lot more of buying, borrowing, and stealing of ideas. It's a very acquisitive time. And this acquisitiveness is more reflected in borrowing from Islamic art, from the art of the region, by the Northern and Western Europeans than the other way around.
Really? Why? What does the Middle East have to offer Europe at the time?
Pretty much everything. This is a cliche, of course, but it's willing, like every cliche, it has its elements of truth. You notice I've said Northern and Western Europe. It's the southern reaches around the Mediterranean of Europe, in Italy and in southern France and in Spain, we do have considerable building in stone. We have considerable urbanism. But the Crusaders mainly came from countries like France, northern France, the area that's now Belgium, and the United Kingdom, and they were unused to things that we take for granted, like glazed ceramics, like beautiful glass, like arcuate stone architecture. There is only at the beginning of the Crusades, there's only the beginning of building in large stone architecture in Northern and Western Europe. Most buildings are not built of stone. So when the Crusaders come to the Eastern Mediterranean in the very last years of the 11th century, they find these cities built of stone with sewerage canals, with fountains. The wealthier and better off houses have running water. It's really quite a completely different world. And they adopt very quickly a lot of these practices.
And how do they tend to take the practices to Europe? Is it objects that they're taking, or is it ideas? Do they take craftsmen? I mean, how does the transfer of knowledge happen?
Yeah, it's very acquisitive. So it's a matter of taking better ideas when you see them. And this acquisition has to do, obviously, with smaller objects, of acquiring them and taking them back to Europe in the form of textiles, in the form of objects. But also, of course, on the ground, putting people to work who know how to build the buildings that you want to get built. It's not as if you don't have any architects. There's plenty of example, especially as the period progresses, of builders coming from, especially France, but also Italy, to help in the rebuilding of churches and pilgrimage sites in the area. But there is definitely a use of local architects and builders. And one of the great joys of studying this period in the last 20 years is having art historians and architectural historians looking much more closely and looking without a sort of colonial lens at this architecture and recognizing that things that look French Gothic or look Romanesque are actually, there's plenty of evidence in them of local builders and local ideas being used. So you don't have to use a local builder, but you can look at a building that's there and take over some of the ideas.
So do you think people would have seen buildings in the Middle East and built similar ones, and then the look of these buildings then was transferred to Europe?
Yes, I mean, the most obvious of these is, of course, we're here in London with the temple, as bombed as it was during the Second World War. There are plenty of churches around Western Europe that in a certain way, I don't want to say imitate, but are inspired by and take as an example the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There are plenty of ideas about carving. You and I have talked about tile work and its importation and its the beginning of tiling of cathedrals and churches and palaces in the 12th century. There are lots of architectural ideas then that are exchanged back and forth. And this is one of the joys, but also the frustrations of studying this period, because very few objects and buildings are dated. So everyone understands that there are all sorts of ideas being exchanged back and forth, in military art, in other kinds of architecture. But it's very difficult to untangle who is learning what from whom at what time. And that's fine. That's fine. This kind of art historical archaeology, as it were, not horizontal archaeology, but vertical archaeology goes on.
But why was it that the Middle East was more advanced in terms of glass and tile work and textile production?
Well, you have Northern and Western Europe that is less urbanized, there is much less monetization, to the extent that when the Crusaders come to the Eastern Mediterranean, they are cheek by jowl with the largest, most powerful, the wealthiest economy in the entire Mediterranean, which is that of Egypt. And as is well known, probably to lots of listeners as well, the Crusaders, who are ostensibly, of course, in this area in order to save Jerusalem and save local Christians from Muslims, forgetting that, of course, this area was conquered over 400 years earlier, they end up adopting the gold coinage of the Fatimids. One of the interesting thought exercises you can do with the Crusades is actually, think of an archaeologist in 1,000 years digging up the coins of the Crusaders, and they look like bad imitations. Coinage of Jerusalem looks like bad imitations of the coinage of the Fatimids. So, you can make a joke of this and say, well, who were these people? Because there are Shia formulas on this coinage written in Arabic. Were they some sort of an offshoot of Shia Islam that settled in Jerusalem? So this kind of monetization, this coming into an urbanized, monetarized civilization with lots of craft specialization is not something that's possible in a largely decentralized, demonetized sort of barter economy that is found in large parts of Northern and Western Europe, especially at the beginning of the Crusades. Things change, of course, in the 12th century.
So you've spoken a lot about the Middle East having this developed economy that produced beautiful things. But what did Europe or Northern Europe have to offer the Middle East? I mean, if you're going to trade, you have to trade in something.
Yeah, it's an exploitative relationship. We always think about Europe and other parts of the developed world producing goods that other people want, but it's the other way around. So, as you say, there has to be a give and take. What do Northern and Western Europeans have to offer in exchange? There's basically a silver shortage in the 11th century in this region, and in the 12th century, silver mines are discovered in Bohemia and today's Czech Republic, as well as in Bavaria in southern Germany. So there's actually an exchange of manufactured goods from the Islamic world to Christian Europe that is sending basically bullion, that is sending ingots of silver, and also coinage that is then melted down and used by artisans and economies in the Islamic world. The textiles of the Eastern Mediterranean are superior, and there are many more different kinds of them, but of course, Northern and Western Europe is famous for its wool, and so there's an export of wool, but also the only real manufactured goods that we know of are woolen textiles from Northern Europe, from England, and from the Low Countries that also begin to compete later on in this 200-year period. Tin also from Cornwall. The tin sources are there aren't very many tin sources in this region. So you either have to get your tin from Cornwall or from Afghanistan. And once the Crusades and the Crusader networks start to develop by sea, it becomes easier to bring in tin from Cornwall.
I can understand the importance of silver, but why is tin a relevant material?
Tin needs to be added to copper to get bronze. So there's a large industry of metalwork industry, and you need tin to add to copper to stiffen it, to make vessels that are hard enough to stand up to wear and tear. And by the way, when we talk about the Islamic world, we're talking about an Islamic world that opens with Northern and Western Europe up to the rest of the world. So you have caravans that are coming, of course, across land, what we call the Silk Route, but it's bringing all sorts of things from Eastern Europe, Eastern Asia, but also, of course, there's the spice trade and also the ceramic trade that's coming by sea, as well as, of course, lots of trade with India for cloth, as well as spices. So the Crusaders, when they go there, Northern and Western Europeans who come as fighters or as pilgrims or as settlers encounter these, not only beauty, but these olfactory explosions of, exposure to a whole range of colors and sensations and tastes that they don't have. And that definitely, this sort of sensory overload is something that you can only imagine to somebody who comes from an isolated village or chateau on the land in today's Belgium or northeastern France.
Thanks. Well, you mentioned people coming to fight, but also settlers and pilgrims. I mean, do we have evidence about the kind of interaction between the Crusaders and people from the Middle East?
Yes, of course, with the battles for territory, the competition for land and for goods, you do have lots of contact that's physical in terms of ongoing battles. But it's important to remember that Crusader states, and there were 4 of them, are allied with their Muslim neighbors, as well as fighting with them and the other way around. And there are Muslims who are fighting each other, of course, for power and influence. People are meeting on the battlefield, but they're also meeting during truces. They're exchanging gifts between them in embassies. And then the physical structure of the Crusader states demands that there is an interaction, a very sort of close interaction, because the great cities of Syria are inland, Aleppo in the north and Damascus in the south, but also Hama and Homs in the middle. And the caravan roads lead down to the coast, which is under the control of the Crusaders. So the physical setup of these states demands that the caravans keep on going. And in fact, the famous Spanish Muslim traveler Ibn Jubayr, who goes through these areas in the 1180s, is really shocked to see that really people are raiding and trading more or less at the same time. So a battle will be ending, and then the caravans start up again.
And do we have any specific accounts of the nobility interacting, or is it only through commerce and trade?
Yes, one of the interesting things about this period is that there's a sort of parallels can be drawn between the structures of the two sides. Both of them have ruling military elites. So the Crusaders have come in from the north and west. They are Latin Christians, and they rule over local Christians as well as local Muslims. And they are nobles. There is nobility. There is not a similar noble structure in the Islamic world, but there is this Turkish and later on Kurdish ruling military elite that rules over, and of course with the cooperation of the local Arabic-speaking populations, which are of course Muslim as well as Christian. These elites recognize each other as being skilled on the battlefield, skilled in the arts of war, skilled in the arts of equerry, so anything to do with a horse. And there's a huge trade for anything to do with hunting, especially hunting dogs and hunting birds. And so in between truces, we know between battles, there would be truces, and the Crusader armies and the Muslim armies would actually trade hunting animals between the two of them. And we do have, from the famous autobiography of Usama ibn Munkith, we have stories of him both fighting the Crusaders, but also going hunting with them. So the elite is exchanging goods and exchanging information, but also getting goods from each other in terms of booty, in terms of seizing the tents and the contents of the armor and the swords of the foe when it's defeated.
How did they communicate at times when they weren't fighting and were going hunting together?
This is the elite, of course. This is what we tend to think of, but one of the interesting things about studying the period of the Crusades is that the elites get less important as time goes by. And the cities, the merchant elites of the cities become very wealthy, and they become themselves patrons of the arts, and they trade goods back and forth. So that you, of course, have Christians who speak Arabic on both sides, if you want to go back to that duality. You have people of French, shall we say, origin or English origin who've settled there, who've married a local Christian or a convert to Christianity, and their children will speak Arabic. As the Crusades go on, there are plenty of common ways for people to exchange information. And also along the coast, you have the origins of what we call lingua franca, which is a sort of pidgin or a patois, a language that is a mixture of Arabic, Greek, and Italian that you can speak. You know, me buy, you sell. I'm being facetious here, but you can speak very basically in any port around the Mediterranean. And so it makes it a lot easier to buy and sell when you can, speak this sort of merchant's language that's good enough for you to exchange goods.
But do we have evidence of people thinking that they like the way the Crusaders looked or the way they dressed, or vice versa?
Yes, in fact, we have pilgrims and monarchs coming in from Western Europe in the mid to late 13th century, and they are shocked by what they see. The Crusader ruler of Beirut is living in luxury in a beautiful palace with a courtyard, with a plish-plashing fountain, and other people elsewhere are dressing in the style of dress of the region, and in a sort of Orientalism avant la lettre, you have them saying, oh, these people have been seduced by the luxuries of the East. They've become soft and effeminate. And that's why they're not winning the battles. And we are coming, they're shocked by their fellow Latin Christians when they see some of them, the more puritanical of them, shall we say, are put off by the high level of the good life that is being enjoyed by the people who have settled there. After all, they've been there for decades, if not over 100 years. They're very well accustomed to life there. So yes, certainly food and dress are things that people notice when they come from the West.
Given that you're a specialist on art and architecture, can you tell me about a few magnificent objects that have survived from the time of the Crusades and what makes them special?
Just to continue the conversation which we just left off, one of the really interesting aspects of the art of the 13th century, that is the Second Crusader century, is that the inlaid metalwork of the Muslim rulers of Syria, the Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin, produced lots of beautiful metalwork, but somewhere between 30 and 40 objects have survived to this day that prominently use Christian themes. So they show scenes from the Bible, they show processions of saints or monks on metalwork that has Arabic inscriptions. And some of these pieces actually have the names and titles of the rulers of Damascus or Cairo, etc. So this is for those of us who are interested in trying to draw some of these lines across this terrible duality or bifurcation that we're always having to battle against. These beautiful objects of inlaid brass and bronze that have survived are very intriguing because they are pieces of Islamic art. And, Jesus is an Islamic prophet. And it's not necessarily Christian to show scenes Jesus and Mary, but it's fairly unusual in Islamic art, over all of Islamic art, to find such a prominent concentration of objects that are interested somehow in representing, and then you can't help to battle against this idea that people are all getting along and exchanging ideas. But there is an interest on the part of these Muslim rulers in somehow representing and incorporating representations of scenes that are common to Islam and Christianity at this time. And this time is in the 1230s, in the 1240s, in that region of the part of the 13th century. So those pieces of metalwork are really quite astounding. In terms of glasswork, glass also has representation of Christian themes, but actually the piece of glasswork I like the most doesn't have figural imagery on it. It's a enameled and gilded glass that's known very well to Londoners because it's in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and we hope to see all of the great museums of London open very soon. And it's a beautiful goblet called the Luck of Edenhall that is from the late 13th to early 14th century. And it's not figural. It doesn't have representations of the Dome of the Rock or priests or monks. But it's a very beautiful piece of art. It's beautifully done. It has lovely colors. It's complete, and it was somehow made its way back to northern England and stayed in a family. And it supposedly brought luck for hundreds of years to that member of the family who owned it. But whatever the stories are surrounding it, it's a very beautiful piece of glass. So these are two categories of sort of star objects, shall we say. Do you want buildings as well?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I've been emphasizing much too much the exchange of goods and ideas and the monetary and economic side of things. But really, the cliche of studying the Crusades is to go to this part of the world and admire and visit the Crusader castles. And they really are truly stupendous. So I have classic taste in terms of castles. One of these is in Syria, the other one is in Jordan. And they're both called Krak or Kerak. There's Krak de Chevalier or Qalat al-Husn, as it's called in Arabic, in southwestern Syria. And then there's Karak or Kerak de Moab, as it was known by the Crusaders, of course, in western Jordan. These are just stupendous fortifications, but they're not just Crusader, right? They're also built they were there before the Crusaders arrived, and after they were taken from the Crusaders, they were rebuilt and they served as places for garrisons and governors themselves. So they show this sort of exchange of places as well as exchange of ideas, and you can see how different military techniques of defense are being used and reused within them. So those castles are really amazing aspects of the Crusades. But within Islamic architecture per se, Qala'un complex in Cairo is just one of the most stupendous Islamic building complexes, a hospital, a madrasa, and a tomb built by the great Mamluk Sultan Qala'un, who died basically when he was setting off to deal the death blow to the last remaining Crusader cities along the coast. And it celebrates, there is a part of a victory monument to it, but it celebrates Jerusalem. It celebrates, in a very strange way, the sort of appropriation of kinds of Christian ecclesiastical art. It sort of repurposes all of this stuff in a dynamic urban facade. And it's just a very creative building that I still can't understand how it was all built in 1 year. It's a huge building complex.
Well, I love the idea also of castles being a sort of manual from which you learn how your enemy builds and presumably copy that in buildings and then impart your own changes that other people learn from. It's nice to think of architecture as a physical means of learning. And
yes.
Well, I like the saying that Gandhi is supposed to have said of building one's house on strong foundations and then opening all the windows.
That's a great one.
So I think it captures what you're talking about in terms of borrowing and.
Yeah, no, there's this saying of T.S. Eliot, or attributed to T.S. Eliot, that bad poets borrow and good poets steal. So it's an idea really of an active. It's not an influence. It's an active sense of, oh, that's a nice thing. I like that. I want that. And that's the kind of appropriation that I see in the 12th and 13th centuries in this geography that has Egypt to the south and Turkey to the north. And it's very difficult to divide into secular and holy.
Well, what do you think the legacy of the Crusades was? What do we learn from them?
I mentioned the word crusade, and the idea of the Crusades is a 19th century French invention. It's more important for Western Europe because it's for all of their complete defeat, the exposure of Northern and Western Europeans to this world really transformed that region, but it also transformed Italy, which turns into, after the Black Death in the 14th century, turns into a real banking and economic powerhouse. So what lessons can we draw from the Crusades? I guess to take what people say about any historical period with a grain of salt, and also not to think of people as being all that different then than they are now. I get very tired of people who are even prime ministers of this country, of Britain, talking about people with medieval mindsets. In Turkish, they say you have a spider in your head. You're so old-fashioned that you're not thinking clearly. You've let a spider weave its web in your brain. People talk about the medieval period as a period of bigotry and of conservatism, and that's really motivated entirely by the worst kind of religious fanaticism. But as I tried to say at the beginning of this talk, people are using religion for political ends, whatever the religion is and whatever the political ends are around the world now. And it's true that the number of people who actively identify themselves as Christian is down, et cetera, et cetera. But I still think we're in a world that's not too different. People are spinning things right and left, like the troubadours did. They're representing things in the best possible light. So I don't want to draw any sort of particular moral conclusions, except to make people approach this area and ask them to try and see themselves and their fellow citizens in the works of art and architecture as much as they do look for a difference or look for a purer approach to religion, or, again, as you were saying earlier, a series of bloody battles.
Well, thank you. I think as an educator and also as an archaeologist, you make a very strong case for looking at the evidence to understand better and to realize that people in the 12th and the 13th centuries didn't have a spider in their brain, as per your Turkish expression. Do you hope to see a lot more archaeology taking place to enable further understanding?
Yes, I'm very grateful to Barakat. Back in the 1990s, I was fortunate enough 2 years in a row to receive funding for an excavation that I was on, right on the edges of the former Crusader County Principality of Antioch in today's southern Turkey. And I just can't emphasize too much the importance of getting students, getting younger people, younger scholars to make this kind of face-to-face interaction with the landscape, with the architecture, with the urbanism of this region. And we see fewer and fewer people having this chance. There's a risk averseness in Western Europe and in North America. There's also a lack of financial resources. There are plenty of wars and reasons for people not to want to go to parts of this area. And with all of the death and destruction that's happened, for instance, in Syria these last years, it's hard to weep for the destruction of monuments, including those from the period of the Crusades, given all of the other terrible deprivation. But I'm just really hoping that with the coming of peace, whenever it comes to this region, there will be much more of an engagement on the part, especially of the European Union, which uses soft power extremely well, as they did in the 90s, to re-engage with these parts of the world and bring younger scholars and students together from these regions and from outside these regions. And there's so much left to do. There's so much left to understand, as we have only in the last 20 or 30 years. Stop looking at the sources, the written sources, as the sole determinants of the way things are, and start looking more closely at these works of art. And we talked about metalwork, we talked about glass, we talked about ceramics. We don't even have our basic chronologies down for these,
Well, thank you. I think that the call to engage and to interact and to discover through art and architecture is a really fitting one for us. And even before peace comes to the region, I think one of the things that's possible is to explore online and discover collections. And there's nothing to stop us now from looking for the enamel glass and the metalwork that you're talking about and discovering for ourselves the multifaceted nature of the societies that you've been speaking about so eloquently.
As you said, Saif, there are wonderful museum collections online that in isolation we can see lots of beautiful things from this period in the online collections of museums around the world. Would also like to remind anybody who's listening to this podcast about the wonderful website of Museums Without Frontiers, which has really excellent exposure not only to key objects, also found in museums like National Museum of Syria in Damascus and Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, museum collections that are not as well known, but also has wonderful representations of works of architecture as well. So in addition to looking at your favorite objects in your favorite museum online resource, please think of this website as well. It's really wonderful.
Well, thank you for the tip. You've done a lot to send us on this voyage of online discovery.
Thank you, Saif.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you so much, Saif. It has been the most stimulating talk, and I think we have a lot to reflect upon. And thank you so much also for bringing me back to my days at university. It has been wonderful to listen to Professor Redford once again. I would like to also thank our audience for being here with us every week. And if you have missed any of the past podcasts, please do check our website and sign up to join our mailing list so that you can get notification of our upcoming content, and that way to stay tuned to our next week's podcast. I say goodbye to all of you for now, but I look forward to having you next week. Until then, stay well and keep safe.
You were listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House. For more information, please visit our website, asiahousearts.org.